Welcome everyone. I'm Tim Devereux, until recently MAW Vice Chair. As a retired teacher, it's a particular pleasure to be here in National Education Union HQ, Hamilton House. Many thanks to the NEU for their generosity. This is the 11th time I've welcomed a speaker to the Movement for the Abolition of War's Remembrance Lecture, so I'm familiar now with how to prepare an introduction. First step, an internet search. Mererid Hopwood is so famous that, like Bono or Madonna, you only have to put in her first name and you get plenty of results, some of which I will read. Wikipedia. Mererid Hopwood, born February 1964, sorry about that, is a Welsh poet and lyricist currently serving as Archdruid of the National Eisteddfod of Wales, teaching originally from Cardiff. Hopwood graduated with first-class honours in Spanish and German from the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. Aberystwyth Research Portal. Mererid Hopwood is a professor of Welsh and Celtic Studies at Aberystwyth University. She's a poet, translator, children's writer, and peace activist who has won several awards and collaborated with various artists and organisations. British Council. Mererid Hopwood is a first language Welsh speaker who has won the National Eisteddfod and the National Crown. She is also a fellow of the Academy and a prolific translator of German poetry into Welsh. 2023, Mererid Hopwood awarded Hay Festival Medal for Poetry. Goodreads. I didn't do them all, I just did a few. I've only got another 7 pages. Mererid Hopwood has 78 books on Goodreads, with 562 ratings. Her most popular book is O Ran, Welsh edition. I have to say that as someone who only managed grade 7s in O-level French once, Russian twice, but a 5 in Latin, the achievement that hugely impresses me is translating German poetry into Welsh. Not just German, but German poetry. Wow. So, with her title, Imagining Peace, taking inspiration from the 1923-24 Welsh Women's Peace Petition, it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Mererid Hopwood to speak. Croeso, Mererid. Mi haimo garafdig i'ch ymweld â hyntin I siarad â ni heddiw. And in case you didn't understand my mangled Welsh, welcome Mererid. It is so kind of you to visit London to talk to us today.
Diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad I gael bod gyda chi'r prynhawn yma. Dwi'n gwybod bod nifer ohonoch chi yn medru'r Gymraeg a mae'n hyfryd eich cael chi yma. Ond wrth reswm, sgwrs drwy gyfrwng y Saesneg fydd hon. As members of a group called Hawlio Heddwch, Claiming Peace, the Peace Petition Partnership, we have spent a good deal of the past year or so telling the story I'm about to share with you today. And I'm very grateful to the good people of the movement of the abolition of war to have been invited to give this year's Remembrance Lecture on a Sunday where there is so much, I'm sure, we would rather like to forget. Now, wherever possible, I start any lecture outside Aberystwyth, in Aberystwyth. And our talk today has every right to claim Aber as a starting point and University College of Wales, Aberystwyth to be precise. But given that we're going to be travelling quite a bit together this afternoon, I couldn't resist sharing this photograph with you too. This is Anne Davis, Anne Braminda, that's the name of her farm, recently elected MP, my MP as it happens, and second female Carmarthen MP in history. She is off to Westminster and about to board the train to London in a carriage named after the first female Carmarthen MP, Megan Lloyd George. Two women on a mission, women with hope, women set on changing the world for the better. Our voyage today, however, is not on railway tracks. Rather, it's on the rolling waves of the great Atlantic. We're travelling on this ship, RMS Cedric, and this diary, owned by one of its passengers, will guide us. Let's take a look inside. February the 2nd, Saturday. Leila Megan, the famous Welsh soprano, and her fiancé, Osborne Roberts, are also going on this boat. She goes first class, he second. The line between first and second is severely observed on the boat. February the 3rd, Sunday. A dull, sunless day, but quite fresh. The coast of Ireland is disappearing from sight as I write. The gulls following us with their crook, crook, crook are impatient. In that pathetic fallacy when nature reflects the human condition and those impatient seagulls surely mirroring the emotions of the diarist, we sense the voice of a woman who knows full well how to use words to great effect. Let's jump now to February the 11th. Saw Statue of Liberty glowing in the sunlight. Bitterly cold wind, bright sunshine. At lunch, a pressman came to me and said, "I am from the press. I have nothing to say," I said. "Oh," said he, "we know your story of the Women of Wales movement. We want only your photos. Will you come to the top deck when you have finished?" So we trotted up to the top deck, first class, where we found 4 burly photographers awaiting us. And to one more entry, a whole month hence, March the 12th, Los Angeles. A letter was handed to me as I left the station, an anonymous letter, telling us to get out of the United States. Then who is the author of these entries and in which year is she travelling? We have magicked our way from 2024 to 1924, 100 years ago. And we're in the company of a formidable Welsh woman, Annie Jane Davis, Annie Cwrt Mawr, Llangeitho, Annie Ellis, and by this time, Annie Hughes Griffiths, or perhaps more truthfully in the spirit of her day, Mrs. Peter Hughes Griffiths. And here are her London credentials. He was the Methodist minister of the Capel Cymraeg in Charing Cross. She has travelled from Wales to London and Liverpool and to the USA, where she will be visiting everywhere from New York and Washington, D.C. to San Francisco and Los Angeles. But while the diary of her trip described some typical tourist must-sees, Niagara Falls, Grand Canyon, Lincoln Memorial, this was no ordinary vacation, and Annie, no ordinary tourist. She was part of a delegation of 3 Welsh women tasked with delivering what the South Wales Gazette Abertillery described as a monster petition, one which reputedly would have stretched for 7 miles if its pages of signatures had been placed end to end. The world was grieving. It was just 4 to 5 years after the end of that horrific war. And the women of Wales, led by our Annie, were about to sort it out with a petition, or as it was called then, a memorial, and an appeal, a memorial to honour the people killed in the war, an appeal for peace. The whirlwind US visit chronicled in the diary was the culmination of a 6-month campaign that had seen more than 400 local organisers go door to door, collecting signatures in towns and villages throughout Wales. In all, they gathered 390,296 signatures, which would be an impressive achievement even today when the internet and social media connect us instantly. But this was 100 years ago, at a time when cars and landline telephones were still objects of curiosity. Yet, despite the publicity the appeal petition achieved on both sides of the Atlantic at the time, and despite the creation of lasting institutional links between personal networks between Welsh and American peace campaigners, the story of this extraordinary effort had long since faded from collective memory, not appearing in history books, even in Wales, and not taught in schools. Last summer changed that. I had the pleasure of co-editing a new book, The Appeal, which begins to tell this forgotten history, and with gratitude, and relying heavily on the research and the words of the book's contributors, I shall try to convey to you some of this remarkable story this afternoon, before turning to suggest what its significance might be today as we gather together once more to remember. Felly diolch i'r cyfranwyr I gyd, a dyma nhw fan hyn, the names of the authors of each chapter. If you want to read the book, that would be great. I think there are 6 copies available in the back. Or you can find a short piece that Jenny Mathers and I wrote for The Conversation, the online pan-university magazine, from which I have also drawn heavily for this talk. So we join the story in May 1923. Join. That's an important verb, and we shall be returning to it before the afternoon is out. Let me offer 2 points to set the scene. As already noted, it was some 4 years after the end of the First World War. Over 40,000 soldiers from Wales alone had been killed, while many of their 230,000 compatriots who had also fought returned with life-changing physical injuries and shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder. The war's devastating effects on families and communities instilled a widespread determination that such a conflict should never happen again. 2, and this next point is a bit longer. The association of women with the cause of peace was nothing new at this time. The pre-First World War international women's peace movement had come about explicitly linking peace with the expansion of civic rights to women, especially, but not exclusively, the right to vote. And those words I quoted earlier to describe the petition as a monster petition echoed, deliberately or otherwise, the 1891 women's suffrage petition in Australia, which had itself become widely known as the monster petition. Here it is in the public record office in Victoria, so you can see how long that is. So when the League of Nations, the new League of Nations, was established, envisioned as a practical means of preventing future wars, a means to bring all nations together so that conflicts would be sorted out through friendship, trust, and arbitration. If the men were prominent in it, so too the women, from the beginning. Arbitration. This was Henry Richard Tregaron's big word. His great cause was to persuade people of the benefits of arbitration, not ammunition. And I cannot mention Henry Richard, the Apostle of Peace, without recalling a more recent Apostle of Peace, Adir Bruce Kent. For it was in Tregaron, in an event to commemorate Henry Richard, that I first met Bruce and Valerie, the pair of great force behind MAW. I don't know how you actually say that in English. MAW. Another London connection, Henry Richard, lies in Abney Park. And I remember the day we filmed in that cemetery, and Bruce telling me that if he were Welsh, he would make sure that the grave was kept clean. So now then, challenge. This new league was greeted with great enthusiasm in Wales, including by David, Gwendolyn and Margaret Davies, 3 siblings with personal experience of the horrors of war. David as an officer, Gwendolyn and Margaret as volunteer nurses in a French field hospital. And a donation made possible by the wealth inherited from their industrious grandfather, David Davies of Llandinam, provided practical support for efforts to secure the long-term future of the Welsh branch of the League of Nations Union, or WLNU. So against this background, we finally get to May 1923. For it was in preparation for a conference of the WLNU that the seeds of our petition were sown. Gwilym Davies, a retired Baptist minister and honorary director of the WLNU, was a visionary. This was a man not only committed to the cause of peace, but one with a talent for creating novel and engaging ways of bringing the issue to the attention of the wider public, as we see here from just some of the initiatives of this period. And on the left, so here's the list published in 1927, and they include peace efforts such as the Neges Heddwch ac Ewyllys Da, the peace and goodwill message sent every year by the youth of Wales, unbroken tradition, and it's continued to this day. And this year, the Women's Peace Petition inspired it, Gweithred yw gobaith, hope is an action. It reached an audience of, we believe, about 10.6 million people. The threads, the YouTube, the TikTok, and so on. It's reached 47 countries, including Kenya, Moldova, USA, Australia, Italy, and it's been translated into 67 languages and reached even the Okinawan Times in Japan. So there we are. So it's this visionary Gwilym who wrote to Mary Ellis, a fellow peace activist, with a deceptively simple-sounding proposal. Would it be possible for the women of Wales to approach the women of America and tell them frankly of their concern for the future of civilization? America. Yes, the League of Nations had some glaring omissions, and one empty seat around its grand table was that of the USA. How could a League of Nations prevent a war if not all the nations were around the table? By May 1923, this proposal had developed and was being put forward in this conference in Aberystwyth University, probably the old college. Annie Hughes-Griffiths gave an address, I love this, The Women of Wales and World Peace. Why not? And a motion was proposed, seconded and carried, and a committee was duly formed. And as we all know, if you have a committee, then you're really in business. Better still if you have a subcommittee, and there would be plenty of those. The business in question could not have been more ambitious. The petition would be a memorial, yes, but not a village hall or a sombre stone column, rather a call to action. It was time to achieve world peace. And these women had a pragmatic plan. No wishy-washy world peace mans, but a clear strategy. They would call on women in the US to persuade their leaders to join the League of Nations. And they also had a leader, Annie Hughes-Griffiths. And here we see a purple plaque that has been placed recently on her home in Laura Place, Aberystwyth. Every woman in Wales over the age of 18 was to be approached. The aims of the appeal were to be explained to them, and then they would be given the opportunity to support it by adding their signature. The campaign had just 2 paid organisers, otherwise it was all volunteer. Public meetings were held to spread the word of the campaign in advance of the door-to-door canvassing. Thousands of sheets of paper were printed so that the 400 organisers could collect individual signatures or add a cross had they been denied the privilege of literacy. The words on the petition sheets in both Welsh and English included the following plea. I have it there in Welsh, so I'll read it in English. We speak simply as the women of Wales, the daughters of a nation whose glory it has been to cherish no hatred towards any land or people. This phrase echoes Lincoln's second inaugural address. And whose desire is for the coming on earth of the reign of fellowship and goodwill. We long for the day when the affairs of nations shall be subject no longer to the verdict of the sword. And we feel that the dawn of the peace which shall endure would be hastened, were it possible for America to take a place in the Council of the League of Nations. The petition's organisers worked sometimes for miles in the wind and rain to ensure no houses in their area were overlooked. Just to remind you of how many were collected, almost 400,000. The weather in November 93 was apparently very stormy, and some of the petition sheets have ink stains and finger marks showing signs of having been wet by rain and tears. But the canvassers were determined, and so too the signatories. There is a touching story that Catrin Stevens uncovered about 2 neighbours, both living in considerable poverty, who pooled their limited resources to buy a shade pen and a pot of ink so they would be ready when the petition came to their doors. One important note here, this was, to use today's language, an inclusive petition. No matter what language, religion, political persuasion, no matter how poor or how rich, formally educated or otherwise, no matter anything. If you were a woman, 18 years of age plus, and living in Wales, you were invited to sign. We have since found some men have sneaked in, and some Welsh women living in England. Well, by the end of January 1924, the process of gathering support was finished, with many ups and downs along the way, and the thousands of sheets were carefully placed in a heavy oak chest designed specifically for the purpose. 2 copies of the appeal text were written in beautiful calligraphy and placed in binders made of gilded Moroccan leather. 1 copy was to travel to the US to be presented with the petition sheets, while the other would remain in Wales. Now, the planning and preparation for the US trip had begun even before the appeal was adopted. This aspect was led by Mary Ellis. Here she is, about a decade earlier, the tutty, little one, on Aberystwyth Station with Annie. Annie was particularly tall, as you can see. By the way, Mary Ellis was the second only female HMI, Inspector of Schools, in Wales. And she had spent months exchanging letters with leaders of the American women's peace movement. In December already, 1923, she set off to New York City as the vanguard for the other members of the delegation. They were to follow in February. And in New York, Mary met some of the most famous women activists in America, leaders in campaigns for political and social change. Ruth Morgan, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Eleanor Roosevelt each had honed their advocacy skills during the long fight for women suffrage. But it was Harriet Laidlaw, a formidable organiser with extensive contacts in the American women's movement and an ability to arrange at-homes to die for. It was she who proved a particularly valuable contact for Mary. She ensured that dozens of women's organisations lent their support to the Welsh Women's Appeal. It was also Harriet who arranged for the Welsh delegation to be received by the US President at the White House. Though please note, this was not the main purpose of the voyage, nor the highlight, as some journalists have been misguidedly keen to claim in recent times. The target was the women. The President, an afterthought, shall we say. So with all this support, little wonder that Mary Ellis would later describe Laidlaw as the fairy godmother of the appeal. So on February the 2nd, the day Annie spotted Leila McGann and her fiancé, and by the way, Annie later gave Leila McGann away to Osborne Roberts during their marriage on this very trip. This will be very interesting for the people from Wales here, I know. The rest of the Welsh delegation boarded a train at London's Euston Station, just on the corner from here, bound for Liverpool, and well-wishers crowding the platform with congratulatory telegrams arriving from Lloyd George, among others. Now, as we know, Annie Hughes-Griffiths, a charismatic figure at ease communicating in both English and Welsh, had been chosen to lead the delegation. The youngest member was Mererid Hopwood, who had done extensive work with refugees in Romania after the war on behalf of the Red Cross. In a series of dispatches printed in the Western Mail, Mererid Hopwood described the scene on arrival. When we reached land, several leaders of American women's organizations met us, carrying bunches of daffodils whose patches of bright yellow first caught our eyes among the throng on the landing stage. Mary had already written to warn Annie and Eluned that they would be the focus of attention when they arrived and that they should expect to be photographed for the American newspapers, and her advice, put on your prettiest and smile. The Welsh women spent a week in New York networking with American women peace campaigners and attending social events. Annie gave numerous press interviews and speeches, most notably on February the 19th, 1924, when more than 400 women, representing over 60 American Women's Association, with a combined membership of more than 16 million, gathered in the grand ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel in Midtown Manhattan to witness the opening of the wooden chest and the circulation of the petition sheets for the first time. The success of the Biltmore Hotel event exceeded all hopes and expectations, as testified in a letter Mary wrote to Gwilym Davies the very next day. And by the way, Mary ended up marrying Gwilym. There's a lot of romance in this trip. Mrs. G made a great speech, she wrote, in every sense of the word. When she read the memorial, Miss Priest and I stood up. I felt absolutely pent up with emotion. The reception by the American women was incredible. They listened to every word and their faces was a study to see. The most wonderful thing is the absolute understanding of our own message and mission. Wonderful. This was a very American word, according to Mary, and she clearly enjoyed using it. And elsewhere, we learn how the first questions from the excited audience in the Biltmore came from delegates of Welsh ancestry who asked things like, has anyone from Sir Feirionnydd signed? So from New York, the delegation went to Washington, D.C., where they were photographed on the steps of the White House. And they did meet the president. Where are we? There we are. So where were we now? So we got to Washington and met with President Coolidge, yes, who promised that the petition would be given over to the safekeeping of the Smithsonian Institution, America's National Museum. And later we would find out that it did indeed go there and stayed there for almost a century, unknown to new generations of Welsh women and men across the Atlantic. Having accomplished their mission of delivering the appeal, the peace delegation went their separate ways. Mary Ellis to visit American colleges, Lynette Priest to reconnect with friends from her work in Romania, and Walter Kochnig, whom she eventually married. We thought at first that he was an Austrian count, It sounded so exciting somehow. He wasn't a count, he was Austrian, and they did get married, and they ended up in Geneva and back in the States, and we're now reconnecting with her granddaughter. This is very exciting. Anyway, Annie, accompanied by her friend Gladys, embarked on a peace tour of the US by train, all the way to California and back. It was towards the end of this Pan-America tour that Annie was handed that anonymous letter I quoted from at the beginning, telling her to get out of the country. Although she passes over this quite lightly in her diary entry for that day, the episode does reveal the strength of American isolationist feeling at the time. While many enthusiastic American supporters of the League of Nations wanted to see the US play a lead role in future efforts to prevent global war, others blamed Europe for dragging their country into violent hostilities, and the Welsh appeal had landed squarely in the middle of these tensions. And the American women who helped Mary Ellis arrange their visit had complicated political waters to navigate. And they played down the political aspect. They stressed that this was a woman-to-woman appeal for peace, took care to emphasise it as a general plea for peace through sisterhood rather than directly linking it to the League of Nations. Progressive causes, including international efforts to promote peace, were increasingly being labelled subversive and viewed with suspicion, including by the institutions in the US, such as the War Department and the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI. And Dr. Eilis Barker, a Welsh historian living in the US, has drawn attention to the spider's web that sought to link women and peace activism to the red threat. Now, this point about the delicate matter of the link between the peace petition and politics explains the confusion that surrounded Margaret Lloyd George's petition in the signing. Did she or didn't she? At first there are reports keen to boast that she did, and then elsewhere this is played down. So important was the non-political nature of the petition. We are not actuated by any political motives. Those were the words of the appeal. Nid amcanion gwleidyddol sydd wrth wraidd ein hymdrechion ni, ond gyfeillion wrth gwrs yr oedd Margaret Lloyd George wedi llofnodi, a dyma hi ar y top, along with others from the Cricieth and Llanystumdwy area. And remember, there were sheets like this from all parts of Wales. And I think, Carol Bell, I might have found one of your bells, and Mary Pritchard, I think I found a Pritchard, and we'll have a chat afterwards. But the US never did join the League, and we know that another war would soon come with its horrors to the world. And although many of the ideas connected with the League of Nations were resurrected in the United Nations, by then the Welsh Women's Appeal had been forgotten by all, except those most closely involved in it. So we fast forward 90 years to 2014, and one summer day, 10 years ago, a search for examples of Welsh peace activism in the collection of the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, Cardiff, here in the magnificent library of the Temple of Peace, turned up a discovery beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The WCIA's then director, Martin Pollard, withdrew a slender brown spine from between statistical reports from the 30s about the arms trade, made of Moroccan leather and apparently never previously recorded as part of the library's collection. The illuminated gold leaf inscription on the front cover identified it as the Memorial from Wales, signed by 390,296 women to the women of the USA. Memorial, remember that word. And inside the leather binding was the text of the appeal, written in immaculate calligraphy, expressing the anguish, hopes and dreams of a generation of Welsh women who were uniting to call for peace. Finding the text of the appeal was only the first step in a long and complex journey of rediscovery that remains ongoing. A cascade of crucial discoveries has kept this research moving forwards, including the realizations that an old photograph showing 4 women standing on the exterior steps of a building, with one of them holding what appears to be a large open book, was in fact the Welsh Women's Delegation in Washington, D.C., and the book, a gift copy of the Moroccan leather-bound appeal. Well, we needed a committee, and it has been my absolute honour to chair the Hawlio Heddwch Peace Petition Partnership on behalf of Academi Heddwch Cymru, Wales's National Peace Institute. Diolches eisoes i awduron y llyfr, nawr y diolch nesaf i'r partneriaid hyn. After about 7 years of working with grassroots organisations, including Heddwch 9 MAW a Grandmother's Peace, Wales and American branch, please note, and national institutions such as the National Library of Wales, and with generous funding from the Welsh Government, the Lottery, and wonderful cooperation with the Smithsonian, the petition was finally repatriated, or rematriated, as we began to say, and returned to Wales. This was a long and painstaking stuff. Here I am with some of the Grandmother's Peace, Heddwch 9 MAW USA branch outside the Smithsonian. But it was worth every effort. And finally, in April 24, the most welcomed piece of lost luggage ever returned to Wales. Just look at the size of the box. By today, the petition sheets have already been catalogued, scanned, uploaded by staff at the National Library, and now volunteers are busy transcribing them. And if you can understand Welsh, because some of the place names are quite difficult, we're still looking for volunteers, by the way. We are now building up a picture of women who played crucial roles in this story, of how they managed to bypass the formalities of governments and officials and speak directly as a nation's voluntary effort, to use Annie's phrase. In taking this direct approach, one nation's women reaching out to another's, it was the first peacemaking effort of its kind. And yes, some have questioned the value of the appeal since the aim was never realised, but that surely is a short-sighted response. I believe instead that it should inspire us to reflect on what we today can do to carry on the good work and pick up where they left off. For remember, while packing away the petition in a chest might have inadvertently succeeded in hiding this testament to peacemaking, the spirit that dared hope for a world without war was not suppressed in Wales, nor among the women in the USA for that matter. The Welsh women's voyage to America forged lasting bonds between Wales and America, or the women's peace movements at least, and inspired the creation of a new US peace organisation, the National Committee for the Cause and Cure of War, from the peace pilgrimages of the late 1920s to the March on Greenham Common in 1981, CND Cymru, Cymdeithas y Cymod, to 21st initiatives such as the founding of Academi Heddwch, of which Rowan Williams is its chair, and Heddwch ar Waith, Peace Action Wales. The work continues. Retelling this story is part of that work. But what else? What should we be learning from this astonishing endeavour? Rowan Williams, in his excellent peace lecture in Llangollen this year, as he reflected on the peace petition, paused to draw attention to and these are his words, to the significance of the international voice of civil society. He insisted that focusing on the fact that the US did not join the League of Nations is to score cheap points, stressing that large-scale petitions seldom, if ever, force major shifts in international policy overnight, before going on to remind us that what they do is gradually widen what is regarded as normal in political argument in a society. And he gave examples from recent times, including the smoking ban, to show how, and I quote him again, in a relatively short time, the default setting of politics can be shifted. Things become thinkable. Activism, he said, can change the dial. He also drew attention to how our grandmothers had placed the anti-war campaign in its wider context and took the risk almost of being more than a single-issue project, making connections between war and the arms trades on one side and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals on the other. There we are. I'll read the Welsh now then. Ymhyfrydwn yn y mesur o gydweithio fi eisoes rhwng Prydain a'r America yng Nghenadledd Washington cyfyngu môr arfau yn y trefniadau dyngarol yn Genefa pan ymdrechwyd rhoi terfyn ar warth y marchnato mewn menywod a phlant ac yn yr ymdrech i ymladd y fasnach mewn opiwm a chyffur peryglus eraill. And here, Rowan Williams drew parallels with one of the greatest needs in our contemporary political discourse, namely the need to join up the critical problems we face as a species. These issues are not standalone issues, he said. They are complex and interwoven. Now, you remember how I said towards the beginning of this talk that we would join the story in May 23. Join? Because I could hear Rowan Williams' peace lecture chime in my ears. Civil society activism, he said, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Let's consider two things here. First, the issues, the ideas themselves. New thinking, new imagining doesn't come from nothing. But what else? The second consideration is this. By using the verb join in, we see how we're creating a connection not only with the ideas, but also the structures of delivery, structures in our society that we need to revive. A structure of mutual engagement and commitment, a thick texture of social interaction that helps people win each other's trust and enables robust and demanding argument. Rowan's words again. In 1923, there were plenty such structures. Chapel and church temperance movements, suffrage campaigns, canvassing, in a word, volunteering. Today, there are perhaps too few such structures. We have become too often too isolated. The harmful narrative of there is no such thing as society still reverberates. And yet, we can still find shining examples of such structures here and there, enough for us to start the rebuilding. Take events such as this, and the Cymanfa that will follow in the Welsh Chapel this evening. And if you don't know about it, find out and go along. The preparation, the planning, the coming together, the hoping together, the visioning together, the volunteering and community organisation, all of which are experiences that educate us in becoming societies, communities, neighbourhoods, earning one another's trust, overcoming disagreement, getting things done. And boy, can't we hear Bruce there, for the benefit of one another. It is this cooperation, the joint focus on community, that brings about what Rowan Williams calls ethical literacy. And he stressed that his phrase was ethical literacy, not moral purity. He described how ethical literacy can bring about moments in history where a critical mass of the population is able to identify aspects of a system, national or international, as destructively inhuman, and to say digon yw digon, enough is enough. He reminded us of the Solidarność movement, the Velvet Revolution, the end of Salazar's regime in Portugal, and he acknowledged how all of these examples have been followed by a return to routine politics, to compromise, failure, and even corruption. But the important thing is, however, that at certain points, some person or group is able to do two things: to identify a radical alternative vision of society and to persuade ordinary citizens that it is not impossible and that their individual collaboration can be part of accumulating in change of the political weather. The National Heritage Lottery grant we were given as the Academy Heddwch to get the Peace Petition Partnership off the ground had as one of its aims the creation of a new generation of peace activists. Well, those were Rowan's words there. And here's an example of just one project that has seen women in the Ruthin area stitch their signatures into a beautiful new quilted petition under the direction of artist Bethan Hughes. And in so doing, talking about peace, daring to imagine it. We are also in the process of developing a peace conversation framework based on Johan Galtung's notion of positive peace, a peace that is much more than the absence of war. And we are currently working on a report that seeks to start a related conversation about what would it mean for Wales to become a nation of peace. And there's a conference next Saturday in the Temple of Peace if you want to come along to find out more. This kind of work means that over time, things become thinkable. And thinking, friends, makes all the difference. It enables us to offer up a new narrative, new thoughts that can change the world. How true are the words in UNESCO's visionary constitutions? Since wars begin, wel, efallai yn y Gymraeg, a mae'n meddwl dynion y menywod a mae rhyfeloedd yn dechrau. Yn meddwl dynion y menywod hefyd a mae'n rhaid adeiladu am ddiffynfeydd heddwch. And what is the source of this new thinking? This new imagining of better things? That's hope, friends. Not the crossing of fingers kind of hope. Hope for the best hope. No. But the radical hope, that energy that allows us to see the better place and find the way of getting there. Remember Raymond Williams, to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. And when you're about to despair, to lose hope and think, oh, little me can't do anything at all about anything, think Francis Sheehy Skeffington. He was a remarkable campaigner for women's suffrage and peace. He was shot, unfortunately, in the Easter Rising in Ireland. He had many views that were way ahead of his time, so much so that someone, in an effort to insult him, called him a crank. He replied with words to the effect, "That's right, a small tool that causes revolutions." I love that. No matter how small and insignificant we may believe ourselves to be, we can cause revolutions. So how do we imagine peace? Well, what about the persistent symbol of peace, at least in our part of the world, the dove? Fragile? Perhaps, but look again. Think of the shaft of the feather. Have you ever tried to snap a shaft in a feather? It's impossible. And by the way, these posters, Jackie Morris and I are selling, and the money goes to Médecins Sans Frontières. And beneath this is a little englyn that says, "Bydd gryf fel craidd dy blifyn, carian llwyth yn ystwyth, ac estyn dy gan i'n dalan i'n dyn, yn dy olau, dielyn, be strong, like the shaft of your feather." But we need to imagine more than a bird, no matter how beautiful. It's got to be practical structures built on the foundations of the fair play that we've heard of, and strong foundations, the kind of strength with which, a century ago, the Women's Memorial was launched. A strength that turned remembering into an action, not a static column, and an appeal that declared in the English version, the future is big with hope. I love that. It's not a very English somehow, but it's lovely. The future is big with hope, as it called on the women of this generation, to aid in the effort to hand down to the generations which come after us the proud heritage of a war-less world. That responsibility is now ours. So what does it look like, this war-less world? Well, I shall leave that question with you. Diolch am wrando. Thank you.